Let me tell you about an animal that history has completely lied to you about. You already have a picture of it in your head. Round, waddling, comically fat. A beak that looks like it was designed by someone who had never seen a bird before. Stumpy little wings that could not lift a paperweight. And dumb. So famously, so thoroughly dumb, that its name became a permanent entry in the English language. You call something a dodo when you want to say it had no chance. The dodo. The bird that walked up to sailors and basically handed itself over. The bird so bad at survival, it practically went extinct by accident. The cautionary tale we all learned about at some point, usually accompanied by a slightly sad cartoon illustration. Every single part of that image is wrong. The dodo was not fat. The dodo was not stupid. The dodo was not hunted to extinction for food. The dodo did not walk calmly into the arms of sailors because it lacked the sense to be afraid, and its name does not even mean what you think it means. The real story of the dodo is stranger, sadder, and more disturbing than the cartoon version, because the dodo was not a comedy of errors. It was a functioning, well-adapted animal that had spent millions of years building a life perfectly suited to its world. And then, in less than 100 years, that world was dismantled by a creature the dodo had never encountered, could not have prepared for, and had absolutely no defense against. And that creature was not a sailor. It was a rat. Let's get into it. Let us start with the most basic thing and get it out of the way immediately, because it reframes everything else in this story. The round, waddling, almost spherical bird you picture when someone says dodo is not what a dodo actually looked like. That image, which has appeared in books and museum exhibits and cartoons for 400 years, is based on captive birds. Specifically, birds that sailors deliberately overfed. Here is what happened. When European sailors first reached the island of Mauritius in the late 1500s, they captured dodos and brought them back on ships, sometimes alive, as curiosities. By the time these birds arrived in Europe and sat for their portraits, they had been kept in captivity and fed by humans who had no idea what a dodo was supposed to eat, or how much. The birds got fat, extremely fat, and the artists painted what they saw. Those paintings became the reference. Every subsequent illustration was based on those illustrations. Every museum model was based on those paintings. The image compounded across centuries, each version borrowing from the last, all of them tracing their lineage back to a handful of captive birds that were basically being force-fed on a ship. In the wild, the dodo was a completely different animal. Lean, upright, fast enough to move through dense Mauritian forest without any trouble. Researchers who have studied the actual skeletal evidence describe the wild dodo as nothing like its famous portrait. It even had a seasonal weight cycle, something that genuinely intelligent, well-adapted animals have. During the hot, wet season from October to March, it was lean and active. During the cooler breeding season from April to September, it put on weight as preparation. The sailors who first arrived during breeding season saw the heaviest possible version of the bird, then imprisoned and overfed it further. And the world drew that version and never looked back. So before anything else, let us agree. The fat, waddling dodo you grew up with never existed. The real bird deserves better than that caricature.
Now that we have corrected the appearance, let us correct the name. Because the word dodo itself has been misunderstood, mistranslated, and then officially enshrined in the wrong meaning by one of the most important scientists in history. The most widely accepted origin of the word dodo is the Dutch word dodas. And dodas does not mean slow. It does not mean stupid. It does not mean hopeless or simple or any of the things the English word has come to represent. Dodas means, roughly translated, fat backside. It was a nickname given by Dutch sailors, almost certainly referring to the tuft of curled feathers on the dodo's rear end, which apparently caught their attention. So the name was a joke. A sailor's joke about a bird's bottom. That is the origin. Now here is where it gets truly absurd. Centuries later, the man who invented modern biological naming, the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus, gave the dodo its official Latin scientific name. Linnaeus is the person responsible for the system of naming every living thing that science still uses today. He is one of the most consequential figures in the history of biology, and he named the dodo Dedus ineptus. Ineptus. As in inept. As in officially, formally, in the scientific record for all time, the stupid bird. So the name that became a global synonym for hopeless incompetence started as a Dutch joke about a feathered backside, was mistranslated over time into something vaguely implying stupidity, and then the most influential biologist who ever lived formalized that mistranslation into Latin and stamped it into science forever. The dodo's entire reputation for stupidity was built on a misread punchline, which is, depending on how you look at it, either very funny or deeply unfair. I would argue it is both.
All right. Here is the part that changes everything. The part that undermines the entire standard narrative of the dodo's extinction. And I want to give it the space it deserves, because it is the most important fact in this whole story, and almost nobody covers it. The standard version of the dodo's extinction goes like this. Sailors arrived on Mauritius, found a fat, stupid bird that could not run away, and ate it into extinction. Simple. Tragic. A cautionary tale about human greed and an animal too dumb to survive. Except the physical evidence does not support it.
Archaeologists excavating the site of Fort Frederick Hendrik, a Dutch settlement on Mauritius, and the most significant colonial site on the island, found a refuse layer, a rubbish heap, essentially, containing the food waste of the settlement across the entire period of occupation. Thousands of animal remains, the leftovers of everything the settlers ate over decades of living on that island. 0 dodo bones. Not a few, not a small number. 0. If sailors were eating dodos routinely, if the dodo was a primary food source hunted to extinction by hungry colonists, you would expect to find dodo remains in the settlement rubbish. You would expect them to be there, the way chicken bones are in a modern bin. They are not there at all. And there is a reason for that. The Dutch settlers actually had a name for the dodo, and it was not flattering. They called it the walgvogel, which translates to disgusting bird. Because apparently the meat was genuinely unpleasant, tough, bad tasting, and not worth the effort when there were better options on the island. So the animal that became the defining symbol of human-caused extinction by hunting was by the best physical evidence available, not primarily hunted for food. The sailors who found it mostly did not bother eating it. The extinction was caused by something else entirely. Something nobody thought to worry about. Something that arrived on every ship without anyone noticing or caring. Something we need to talk about.
Before we get to what actually killed the dodo, I want to spend a moment on what the dodo actually was. Because the evidence that has come out of modern research into dodo biology paints a picture of an animal that was, by any reasonable measure, well suited to its environment. Scientists created the world's first internal cast of a dodo skull by scanning fossil remains, essentially mapping the inside of the brain case to understand what the dodo's brain looked like. And what they found was not the brain of a dim-witted evolutionary dead end. The dodo's brain, relative to its body size, was comparable to its closest living relatives, pigeons. And pigeons, for what it is worth, are not stupid. If you have ever watched a city pigeon figure out a food source, navigate a complex environment, or find its way home across hundreds of miles, you know that pigeons are capable animals with functional, well-organized brains. The dodo was in that family, with that kind of cognitive infrastructure. But here is the more surprising finding. The dodo had large, well-developed olfactory bulbs, the parts of the brain responsible for processing smell. This is unusual for a bird. Birds overwhelmingly prioritize vision. Their optical processing is often the most developed part of their brain. Smell is secondary, and in many bird species, barely functional at all. The dodo had inverted this. It was navigating its world through scent in a way that most birds do not. Researchers believe this was an adaptation to the dense, closed canopy forest of Mauritius, where visibility is limited and smell is a more reliable guide. The dodo had, in other words, developed a sensory toolkit precisely calibrated to the environment it lived in. It was not a generic, default bird that failed to evolve properly. It was a specialist, fine-tuned for Mauritius over millions of years. The animal history called stupid was running a more sophisticated sensory system than most of its living relatives. Its world just ended before that sophistication could matter. Now we get to the behavioral detail that I think is the most devastating single fact in this entire story. And I want you to sit with it for a moment, because once you understand it, the dodo's extinction stops being a story about stupidity and becomes something entirely different. When sailors captured a dodo, when they grabbed one bird and it began to call out in distress, the others nearby did not run. They came toward the sound. They approached the captured bird. They ran from the forest to investigate. Read that again. When one dodo was in distress, the others came running toward it. That behavior did not evolve in a vacuum. It evolved because on an island with no natural predators, with no large carnivores, with nothing that had ever hunted dodos in the millions of years they lived on Mauritius, the correct response to a distressed group member was to move toward them, to investigate, possibly to help. It is the kind of social behavior that makes sense in a community of animals that do not face predation, where a distressed call from another member of your group is more likely to mean they need help than it is to mean there is something nearby that will kill you too. That instinct, in any other context, would look like social cohesion, cooperative behavior,
care for group members. On Mauritius, in the 1600s, it was a death mechanism. Sailors did not need to chase dodos. They did not need to set traps or develop hunting techniques. They captured one, let it call, and killed the birds that responded. Groups were eliminated not through any hunting skill or effort, but because the dodo's own social intelligence, built for a world without predators, guided them into harm. The dodo was not destroyed because it was dumb. It was destroyed because it had evolved, perfectly and completely, for a world that no longer existed. Its intelligence was the wrong kind. Its instincts were calibrated for the wrong threat, and it had no way to adapt fast enough. So, if sailors were not eating the dodo, and if the dodo was not simply walking into their arms out of stupidity, what actually drove it to extinction? 3 animals, primarily, and the most important one weighs about 300 grams. The ships that arrived at Mauritius brought passengers nobody invited. Rats. Black rats, specifically. Rattus rattus. The same species that spread across the world on European ships for centuries. They arrived on every vessel, slipping off ropes and down anchors and through the holds of ships, spreading across every island they touched within months. They also brought pigs and macaques, a species of monkey, and goats and deer. All of them either brought intentionally as livestock or arriving as stowaways, or released onto islands as living food supplies for future voyages. Now think about the dodo's nesting situation. The dodo laid 1 egg per year. 1. It built its nest on the ground, a shallow scrape in the soil surrounded by a bit of grass, because nothing on Mauritius had ever raided a ground nest. There was nothing to fear from ground-level predators, because ground-level predators had not existed on the island. Rats find ground nests easily. Pigs root through undergrowth and eat whatever they find. Macaques are intelligent, opportunistic, and will raid nests whenever the opportunity presents itself. Deer and goats consumed the low vegetation that the dodo depended on for food and cover. The black rat did not need to kill a single adult dodo to destroy the population. It just needed to eat enough eggs. And with a species producing only 1 egg per breeding pair per year, with no nest defense behaviors, with no instinct to protect against a ground predator that had never existed on the island before, the arithmetic was immediately catastrophic. Every egg eaten by a rat was an entire year's reproductive effort by 1 breeding pair. Gone. The population had no mechanism to compensate. No way to produce extra eggs. No way to move nests off the ground. No way to develop fear responses fast enough to matter. A rodent the size of your fist ended a bird that had survived for millions of years on that island. Not through dramatic predation, just by being there, eating eggs season after season until the numbers went one way and never came back. Let us stay on this for a moment, because I think it is important to understand just how quickly the mathematics turned against the dodo once invasive species arrived. 1 egg per year per breeding pair. That reproductive strategy was not a mistake. It was a perfectly reasonable adaptation to a stable island environment with no predators and plentiful food. When you live somewhere safe, when nothing hunts you and food is reliable, there is no survival advantage to producing large clutches of eggs. Instead, you invest your energy into a single egg, a single chick, and give that offspring the best possible chance. Quality over quantity. It is the same strategy used by many long-lived, low-threat environment animals. Albatrosses do it. Large parrots do it. It works beautifully when the environment stays stable. The dodo's environment did not stay stable. It was turned upside down in a matter of years. Once rats and pigs were eating a significant portion of dodo eggs every breeding season, the population math became a one-way door. A population can absorb some egg loss and recover. It cannot absorb substantial, sustained, multi-predator egg loss when its maximum annual replacement rate is 1 chick per breeding pair. Every season that the population produced fewer surviving young than it lost to age and other causes was a net decline. And once you are declining with no ability to surge your reproduction, the question is not whether extinction will happen. It is only how long it will take. The dodo did not have a fighting chance in the biological sense. It was not built for the fight it found itself in. It had one tool, one egg, one shot per year, and the enemy was eating that one shot before it could hatch. Now here is the detail that moves the dodo story from a sad historical fact to something that is still happening right now on the island of Mauritius. The dodo did not live in ecological isolation. Like every animal, it was part of a web of relationships with other species. And one of those relationships was so specific, so close, so perfectly matched, that when the dodo disappeared, its partner in that relationship began dying too, just more slowly. There is a tree on Mauritius called the Calvaria major, sometimes called the tambalacoke tree. It is a large, old tree that produces fruits with a very hard outer coating around the seed. And for a very long time, nobody could figure out why the tree was barely reproducing. The seeds were not germinating. The species was dwindling. By the 1970s, there were reportedly only 13 specimens left on the entire island, and all of them were estimated to be around 300 years old. 300 years old. All of them. Not a single young tree. Because for 300 years, almost no seeds had successfully germinated. The reason, researchers eventually concluded, was the dodo. The tambalacoke fruit appears to have evolved specifically to be eaten by the dodo, whose digestive system would break down the thick outer coating of the seed during digestion and pass it in a state ready to germinate. Without passing through a dodo's gut, the seed coating was too hard. The seed could not sprout. The tree had been waiting for 300 years for an animal that was never coming back. The solution scientists found to save the tree in the short term? Turkeys. It turned out that turkeys could eat the fruit, and their digestive systems were similar enough to break down the coating and allow germination. The tambalacoke tree is currently being kept alive, tenuously, by turkeys acting as emergency stand-ins for a bird that went extinct in the 1600s. The dodo has been gone for 3.5 centuries, and the island it lived on is still dealing with the hole it left. Now, I want to tell you about the last confirmed sighting of a living dodo, because the way it happened is, I think, one of the saddest details in this entire story. By the 1640s, the dodo population had collapsed. The combination of habitat destruction, introduced predators, and egg predation had done its work quickly. Reports from Mauritius in this period describe the dodo as already rare, already something you might not see on a visit to the island. The window was closing fast. The final widely accepted sighting of a living dodo happened in 1662. The man who saw it was a Dutch sailor named Volkert Everts. He was not a naturalist. He was not a scientist or an explorer specifically interested in wildlife. He was a shipwreck survivor, stranded on a small island off the coast of Mauritius after his vessel went down. And while stranded there, he encountered some odd, heavy birds that matched the description of the dodo. He recorded it, not as a moment of historical significance, not as a last sighting of a vanishing species. He wrote about it the way a man notes local wildlife, a brief, practical observation about the animals around him while he waited to be rescued. He had no idea those were the last ones. He had no reason to. Nobody on Earth in 1662 had a concept of species extinction as we understand it today. The idea that a kind of animal could simply cease to exist permanently and irreversibly was not part of how people thought about the world. Animals were abundant. Animals had always been there. Animals would continue to be there. Volkert Everts looked at the last dodos and saw birds. Just birds. And then he was rescued, and he left. And the birds were never confirmed alive again. Nobody knew they were watching the end. That is perhaps the most tragic part of it. Not that the dodo was killed, but that the killing happened without anyone understanding what was being lost until it was already over. Here is where the story arrives in the present day. And I want to be fair about this, because the science involved is genuinely remarkable, even if the questions it raises are uncomfortable. In 2023, a biotechnology company called Colossal Biosciences announced plans to attempt to bring back the dodo. Colossal is also the company working on de-extinction projects for the woolly mammoth and the Tasmanian tiger, and their dodo project follows a similar approach. The plan begins with the Nicobar pigeon, the dodo's closest living relative, and involves editing the germ cells of those pigeons to introduce genetic characteristics more similar to the dodo. The edited cells would eventually produce an animal that looks and behaves more like a dodo than a Nicobar pigeon does. And look, that is genuinely extraordinary science. The idea that we can read the genome of an extinct animal from ancient remains and then engineer its characteristics into a living relative is the kind of thing that would have seemed like pure fiction 20 years ago. But here is the question that needs to be asked, and that does not have an easy answer. What exactly is the animal they will produce? It will not be a dodo. Not genetically, not biologically, not in any complete sense. It will be a Nicobar pigeon with significant genomic edits to make it more dodo-like. Whether that animal carries the dodo's specific digestive biology, the biology that allowed it to process Tambalacoque seeds in a way that made them germinate, is entirely unknown. The
The relationship between the dodo and that tree was built over millions of years of coevolution. You cannot guarantee that a heavily edited pigeon recreates it. And if it does not, then the de-extinction project produces an animal that looks like a dodo, is released into Mauritius, and is ecologically useless for the specific function the dodo served. A cosmetic replacement. A symbol without a purpose.
The tambalak tree has been waiting 350 years for the dodo's gut to come back. The question of whether a gene-edited pigeon is close enough to fulfill that role is one of the most interesting and genuinely unresolved questions in modern conservation biology. The dodo might be coming back. Whether it can actually pick up where it left off is another matter entirely. So, the dodo. Not fat, not stupid, not hunted to extinction for food, not an animal that strolled into disaster because it lacked the sense to avoid it. An animal that had spent millions of years building a life perfectly suited to a specific island with specific tools, specific instincts, and specific relationships, none of which prepared it for the things that arrived on European ships. It was killed by rats and pigs, and the systematic destruction of the one thing its reproductive strategy could not survive: egg predation in a species with no spare eggs to lose. And it was gone before anyone on Earth had the concept of extinction to understand what was happening. The dodo did not fail. The world it was built for failed. And the difference matters. Because the real story is not about a bird too dumb to survive. It is about what happens when a perfectly functioning animal meets a threat so new, so alien to anything in its evolutionary experience, that no amount of intelligence or adaptation could have saved it in time. That story is not ancient history. It is still happening. And the tambalak oak tree, being kept alive by turkeys acting as emergency replacements for a bird that has been gone for 350 years, is the proof. Let me know in the comments, which part of this got to you the most? Was it the rat, the last sailor, the tree that has been waiting 350 years? Or the fact that every image of the dodo you have ever seen was basically wrong? Drop it below. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe, because there is a lot more of it on the way. See you in the next one.